can make yourself up a plate here if you want.
No, that's okay. I'll get
Send in some preliminary
Okay,
stuff
all right.
before the defense. So we're going to go over that on
He's a CPA too.
Yeah, just about anyway.
Yeah.
You can make yourself up a plate here if you want.
No, that's okay. I'll get
Send in some
Okay, all right.
So that's not so steep.
Yeah. Well, I really cut it down.
Hi, Josh.
There are several. I don't know that's on.
Just sort of yeah, you should be able to see it now.
Well, I submitted that in June, actually. It's taking me so long.
Yeah,
I think they couldn't find a second review, or they thought they had one, but then
a lot of
year season, so then they had to get someone else.
This time we went to held the
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah, Tuesday. Yeah,
the service requirements.
So I can see.
Yeah.
I can always talk about it. And I can see them.
Okay, walk in front of the camera. Other side is.
UI.
Okay, well.
It just stings.
Well,
Don't
okay.
worry about it. That's okay.
But I do like
They basically told me exactly what to do.
Good. I'm reading this new book by Benjamin Barber, Municipal.
Oh yeah, I've heard that.
Do you like it? Yeah, it's interesting. It's called The Canaries Rule the World. And the subtitle is just something like Dysfunctional Nations, Functional Cities.
Have you seen it?
No.
Sort of the idea that, in the global world, cities are actually more functional and they do more than nation states that have their hands tied behind the
Oh, you're the cameraman. I am. We're gonna be. Well, it's live now, so.
He's speaking at CPSA, and I'm the moderator of this session. So.
Right. Broadcasting the offer.
I'm trying to get Mayor Nancy because the FCN is there.
Had a great time there. Yeah.
So we're trying to get him. He's provisionally said yes. But, the side
stories
of that. Well, yeah. I get, maybe I'm not supposed to say that. So forget I said that. We're trying to get
So I'm going to get these. Okay, we're going to get going here. So, welcome back everybody to the Local Governance Seminar Series. This is the first of 4 seminars for this term. And thanks to everybody for coming. Now, before I introduce our speaker today, just want to let you know, you see Josh in the middle there doing stuff with a laptop. So this is a new thing that we're trying out. We had a number of requests from part-time MPA students who have to be at work and or are not in town and would like to have access to these talks. So we're piloting some live streaming here, and we're also going to be video archiving the talks. So I'd like to say thanks to Josh for setting this up, and this is our first time around, so we'll see how it goes. And also thanks to our speaker for agreeing to be part of this experiment, as it were. And that brings me then to Dr. David Siegel, and it's a real pleasure for me to introduce him today. Dr. Siegel is Professor of Political Science at Brock University, where he was also for a time the Dean of the Faculty of Social Science. And he's had a long career and has published widely in various aspects of municipal politics and local politics and management. And these days, one of his main interests is administrative leadership. And I know he'll tell you about this. He has a new book that's going to be coming out soon on the subject, and it's what he's going to be talking about today. So please help me welcome Dr. David Siegel.
Great, thanks Martin for that introduction, and thanks for inviting me. I always like to come and talk to these things. I I've done a course here for a number of years in the summer, so this is kind of
Sure, I should have mentioned that too.
back to very familiar territory for me, so that's always great. And I get a chance to talk about this new book that's coming out, which happens to have, the title of the book is exactly the same as the title of my presentation. So what I'm going to do in the presentation today, the presentation is in 3 sections. The book is coming out shortly, so I'm going to start by shamelessly flacking for the book. So let you know about that. Most of what I'm going to be talking about, the trade skills and behaviors of successful municipal CAOs, and then I'm going to conclude with some advice to people who would aspire to become CAOs. So first you have to sit through the shameless flacking part, okay? The book is in process at University of Toronto Press. There's not a definite publication date yet, sometime in the summer or fall. What I did in the book is, the subtitle of the book sort of says it all, the leadership qualities of municipal chief administrative officers. What I did was I identified 5 CAOs who had been recognized by their peers and recognized generally in the community, and these are people from across the country. I identified 5 people who were recognized as successful CAOs, particularly people who had good leadership qualities. And what I did was, the main part of the book is 5 chapters, which are 5 thick case studies about these people. Why did they decide to go into municipal government in the first place? What was their career leading up to CAO? And what was their leadership style? And in order to do this, I spoke obviously to the CAOs themselves 2 or 3 times in some cases, but I also interviewed between 20 and 30 people at 360 degrees around the CAOs to get an idea not just of how the CAOs saw themselves, but how other people saw the CAO. And what I then did was, having these 5 thick case studies, I looked at what were some of the common qualities, what were some of the common characteristics of these 5 people who had been identified as successful leaders, what were some of the qualities that all of these people seemed to share. The purpose of the book, I had several things in mind when I was doing this. One, obviously, I guess, to make a contribution to the literature on leadership. I mean, a whole bunch of books on leadership out there. I don't know if the world really needs another book on leadership to be sold at airport bookstores, but there's not really very much about municipal, about the particular issues around municipal leaders. So that was the contribution that I wanted to make. The second thing I had in mind was to provide, frankly, just to provide advice to aspiring CAOs. I mentioned that I've taught the public sector management, local government management course. I should know the title of the course I teach. Local government management course for a number of years, and people in the course, particularly the mid-career people, would be sort of interested in, some of them were aspiring to be CAOs, and so they wanted to kind of know what sort of reading I could recommend to them, and I had to say, well, I'm not, I don't think I can find a good reading for you, and so that gave me the idea that there was a gap here that should probably be filled, and that's what I wanted to do with this book. I also wanted to demystify the concept of leadership. I think too many times people think about, well, a leader is that person who's way out there. I could never do that. A leader is somebody who's sort of a mythical kind of person on a pedestal. I could never be a leader. So I wanted to figure out what were the qualities of these people and see if those qualities could be developed and learned by other people. And finally, sometimes this was the most important thing in my mind, to tell a story about people who do a really good job at their job. Private sector leaders are really good at telling their own story. They write all these books that do get sold in airport bookstores, and so all these stories get out there. In the private sector, in the public sector rather, people are conditioned to be leaders in the shadows. They're conditioned to the idea of taking a low profile while the politicians get the credit for this. And so they don't tell their story. And so what happens, I think, in the public sector is the idea that what gets out there is the scandals and the problems and the tremendous examples of inefficiency. And there's nothing to balance that, to tell that, there's a whole lot of places where things are going really well, where people are doing a really good job in terms of leadership. And so I wanted to tell that story about people who are doing a really good job, about municipalities that are working very well. So that was what I wanted to do in the book. Okay, trait skills and behaviors of the successful CAOs. First of all, I started with, I didn't start with the definition of what I was looking for in leadership. I let the data lead me to a good definition of leadership. And this is what I came up with, and I borrowed this, I adapted this from a book by Joseph Ross, Leadership in the 21st Century. What I said was that a municipal CAO is a leader who has the ability to move the municipality forward, okay? So, in Ross, and this comes from Ross, you don't get points for stabilizing the situation. You have to be making some sort of change. You have to be making a change and leading the organization in a direction that it would not have gone if the leader wasn't there. The other part I like about this is he talks about mutually influential. Okay. In a lot of, virtually all the leadership on, virtually all the literature on leadership talks about the idea of influential, that leaders might have an ability to command that people do things, but in fact leaders operate on the basis of influence more than command and control. But it's mutual influence in that leaders influence people around them, but leaders also listen to the people around them, and leaders are influenced by the people around them. That's an important part of leadership that I'll talk about. And these leaders, the CAOs as leaders particularly, were working with council, they're working with external stakeholders, and they work with their organizational subordinates. And that leads me to a model that I had in mind when I started this, and what I heard kind of affirmed this, that CAOs really sit in the middle here. They work for council, and they have significant staff working for them, but they also have to deal with people in the community. So a CAO has to lead in three directions. Leading down is pretty straightforward. That's what you imagine that people do. They tell their staff what needs to be done, and hopefully it gets done. But CAOs also have to lead their council, and that's trickier because, what I'm saying here is that the CAO is leading a group of people that they're really supposed to be subordinate to. So I'll talk about that as we go through this. But that is the tricky part, and that's where the influence, the mutually influential aspect of this comes. And it's roughly the same with leading out, dealing with residence groups, business groups, people in the community. They have no authority over these people the way they have over staff, so they have to lead these people by, in some way or another, influencing what they do. So, trait skills and behaviors. I'm going to go through a list of the trait skills and behaviors that I found in these, the leaders, in the CAOs. Generally speaking, the list is somewhat at random. I couldn't figure out a sort of organizing principle. I sort of put them in an order that allows me to talk about them. So generally speaking, it's fairly random, with the exception of the first two things that I'm going to talk about here. The first two things are the things that came through the most strongly, and these first two things are deal breakers, okay? The idea was that if people didn't have these two characteristics, they were not going to be leaders. The other things I talked about, some people had them, strongly other people didn't, and so forth. Integrity is at the top of the list, and a lot of people who do other kinds of research on leadership, this is what they find. Integrity is really at the top of the list. Nobody is comfortable working in an organization where there are issues of integrity at the top of the organization. But a bit of an insight that people gave to me in this in the interviews is that you think about what I call external integrity, you know, the sort of honesty and engaging in contracts and dealing with people and so forth. But people also were very much affected by what they call the kind of internal, or what I guess I use the word internal integrity. And that was that when the CAO tells you as a subordinate that something's going to happen, it happens. You know, a lot of senior people have an idea of promising something that then ends up not being delivered. But these people were, you know, their word was their bond, was a phrase that you heard sometimes. That when they said, you're going to get that new position in your unit this year, I'm sure we can work that out, it happened. Okay? Second thing on the list is respect. The people talked about, all of these CAOs had a tremendous amount of respect within their organization. And so I asked, well, why do you think these people have so much respect? And the usual answer was they have a lot of respect because it's clear that they respect everybody else in their organization, that they respect the people that they deal with. I have a lot of stories, not from the CAOs themselves, but from people at 360 degrees around the CAOs, about the quality of the counselors that the CAOs sometimes had to deal with. Can you understand what I'm saying here? had discussions about the quality of the counselors that the CAOs sometimes had to deal with. But what everybody talked about, and the CAOs talked about, was that you treat everybody with respect. And even if you might have some difficulties with a particular counselor, the office of counsel, the office of counselor is a very important office. It's an office that the citizens are embodying their respect in when they vote for people, and you have respect for that office. And therefore you have respect for the person who holds that office. And they also had respect for everybody that they work for. You know, sometimes as people work up the hierarchy, they have a sense of, well, you know, this person's only a janitor, or that person's only a clerk. Well, that was, you know, one of the things that these CAOs were well respected for was that they respected everybody in the organization. They spoke to everybody in the organization, that they didn't treat anybody like, you know, you're just a janitor sort of thing. They respected everybody in the organization because everybody had a role. So those are the two really important ones. Those were the real deal breakers. Beyond that, the CAO sets the tone of the organization and establishes the organizational culture. One thing that became clear fairly early on is that while CAOs are sitting at the top of the hierarchy and they have the ability to command and control, they seldom use that. They seldom used command and control. They set the tone. You know, when new people came in, and there were several cases that I was looking at where people came in to consciously make change, they set a different tone when they came in. And they did that partly through team building. That particularly in the larger municipalities that I was looking at, you know, a CAO, one person at the top can't possibly do or keep track of everything that's going on in the organization. And they don't even know, you know, like I had people who were, their background was in recreation, and, you know, they're supposed to be a CAO in charge of engineering and so forth. So you can't possibly know these things. What the good CAOs talked about was their job was building a team. Their job wasn't engineering. That's what you hire an engineer for. Their job wasn't finance. That's what you hire an accountant for. Their job was to build a team. And their job was to keep that team together, keep that team focused, and keep that team moving like a team and not like a whole bunch of silos. We'll talk about that in a minute. But that was the idea of recruiting, building, and retaining a team and getting everybody to act as a team. They didn't manage individual functions. They brought people together who managed. Some of these things sort of go together. Counselors are in charge, but sometimes they need professional assistance, okay? So all of the CAOs were conscious of the role of counsel. None of these CAOs tried to usurp the role of counsel in any way. But they did recognize that when it came to certain substantive kinds of knowledge, they had more knowledge than the counselors did. And so they would respectfully advise counselors. They were not shy about offering their professional advice to counselors, but they always did it in a way that they recognized that counselors were in charge. So they had to sort of balance these two things, because it was their job as professionals to be sure that they were providing the best advice to counsel, but they also had to defer to counsel ultimately. Communication is important, and that includes listening. You know, there's this picture, there's this image of a leader. Like, we might think a leader walked in that door today. The leader would be sort of bigger than anybody else and just kind of come in and take charge of the organization. You know, take charge of this session today. You know, the people I dealt with, if they walked in that door today, they'd probably sit over in the side someplace and they'd probably watch what was happening. They would not take charge, because how do you learn about what's going on around you? You know, you don't learn what's going on around you by you taking charge and you dominating the conversation. If you want to learn what's going on around you, you watch the people that you work with, and that's what they were really good at. They were really good at communication, but they were also really good at listening, because listening is an important part of communication. And none of these people were really dominant types. And that leads to the next thing, that all of these people were very perceptive judges of people. That's probably one of the great skills that these people had. And again, because they were a bit reserved and because they watched and listened to people and didn't dominate things, they understood where people were coming from, understood the skills of the people who worked for them, but they also understood where people that they worked for were coming from. They understood what counselors were concerned about. They understood what counselors wanted to accomplish. They understood what counselors would get upset about. So they were perceptive judges of everybody around them. They had this emotional intelligence that is written about them. This phrase "cool as a cucumber" was used in a variety of different, for a variety of different people. You know, if you've ever been to a council meeting, things can get pretty hectic, and there's a lot of name calling sometimes, and a lot of intemperate sort of behavior. The good CAOs were calm. They focused on rationality, that I'll talk about in a minute, and did not get involved in that sort of thing. With regard to change, all of the CAOs accomplished some sort of fairly significant change in the time that they were in the organization. All of my people did it, all of the people that I looked at it, did it in a particular way. They made the change very carefully, and they respected the local customs. You'll sometimes read books about leaders who take great pride in, I walked in that organization, the second day in, I just blew the place up, I fired everybody, and I started all over, and they're really, really macho, really grab control of things. The 5 people in my case studies all made significant changes. They all did it slowly. They all, first of all, established their credibility within the organization with the people that they were going to be working for. Because you're not going to fire everybody in the organization, right? You might fire the people at the top. But if you've alienated people throughout the organization, you're probably never going to get back from that. So they took their time, they established their own credibility, they learned about the organization, and they signaled to people that I respect what you're doing here. You know, you've been here 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. I'm just coming in here. You've been here 20 years. You've done a lot. I think we can do something better if we change a bit, but I respect what you've already done. That was the signal that they were trying to send people by not coming in and blowing the place up, by taking your time in order to, but that didn't mean that they didn't make changes. They did make significant changes. They just did it in a particular way. Provide advice based on rationality. This is something you always have to struggle with in terms of counsel. You know, people will ask me all the time, should I tell counsel what I really believe as an administrator, or should I tell counsel what I want to hear? Well, the only answer to that, the only good answer to that is you have to tell counsel, give them your best professional administrative advice. Whether they want to hear it or not, you have to do that, because when you get pushed to the wall, if you've given them your best professional administrative advice, you will be able to defend that advice. You should be able to. You obviously didn't think it through when you gave it. So you will be able to defend your best professional administrative advice when you get pushed to the wall. If you told them what they wanted to hear, well, you're probably not going to be able to defend what you've said. But at the same time that you're doing that, you also need to anticipate what's going to happen. Because sometimes as an administrator, you're going to be giving advice to counselors that they don't want to hear, and they're going to reject your advice. And they're in charge, and so that's their job, and that's fine. You have to accept that. So you have to anticipate what's going to happen when you give your advice, but you do have to be sure that your advice is always given on rational basis, because otherwise you're going to get tripped up and you're going to look foolish, and that is that's something you really can't recover from. Respect the importance of the balance between task and people orientation. The literature talks about some leaders being task oriented and some being people oriented. Well, it just so happens I lucked into two people, one of whom was the ultimate task oriented engineer, and the other was the ultimate people-oriented recreation. Her original background was in recreation before she got in community development. They both ended up being really effective CAOs, and they both did a really good job as CAOs, even though they started at opposite poles of the task-oriented engineer and the highly people-oriented community developer, because they knew themselves and they didn't try to be something that they're not, okay? Like the engineer told me up front, he said, you know, I'm a task-oriented guy. I don't care much about people. I have difficulty with people, but you know, I managed to work through that. And so because they knew themselves and they didn't try to be, you know, there's nothing worse than a really task-oriented person who's going to try to pretend to be this, you know, really touchy-feely type person. They both focused on their particular abilities, their particular orientation. They used that, and they both were seen as very effective CAOs. That relates to the idea of, you know yourself, you know what your strengths are, and you want to build on your strengths, but you also want to strengthen your weaknesses, okay? So that the CAO that I was talking about, whose original background was in recreation and community development, she got to a particular level in the organization, and she went back and did an MPA. Not here, but she went back and did an MPA while she was in BC. So you know, so she went to University of Victoria, and to get accounting and law and things like that. So you know, she knew what her strengths were, and she was building on those strengths. But she also knew what her weaknesses were, and she developed those weaknesses. People around the people, when I was talking to people about 360 degrees, they talked about these people having passion, you know. In public service, you're supposed to get that beat out of you before you can become a public servant, right? You're not supposed to be passionate about things. I mean, I think that's a rule about being a public servant almost, right? But all of the people who worked for these people, one thing that came up quite a bit was it was just a pleasure to work for that person because I could tell they were really committed to getting this thing done. They were really committed to what they were doing. They were passionate about what they were doing, and it was a pleasure to work for them. And I really knew that we were all in this together. So the idea of, even though public servants are supposed to be completely dispassionate, they're supposed to be cool as a cucumber, the advice I gave earlier, there's also a time to show your passion about how committed you are to this. They were all confident, but they were confident. I'm always careful about talking about this when I talk about people having confidence. They were confident because they took a lot of time to be very well prepared around particular issues. That they weren't the sort of people with what, the old Greek word hubris, about excessive confidence that comes before a fall. A lot of these people, and particularly the people around them, said, we spent a huge amount of time preparing this person for presentations, and then he did a fantastic job on the presentation after we spent a huge amount of time preparing for it. None of these people were self-confident in the sense of, I'll just go in there and wing it, and everything will be okay. Nobody was self-confident in that way. In some ways, you might almost say they were maybe a little bit lacking in confidence because they worked really hard to prepare themselves. Then they appeared very confident in terms of their presentations. They were quite adamant about this idea of tearing down silos and not allowing turf talk within the management group. And that goes back to the idea of team building that I was talking about earlier. Another thing is a balance between supporting staff and being involved in what your staff is doing, but not micromanaging staff. And that was a balance that these people tended to have. Like a lot of the people who worked for these people said, when things were going bad, I knew I could always count on her. He was always going to be there, if I needed some assistance. But you can do that without micromanaging. All of these people were concerned about training and development, and all of these people were mentors in some way or another. I toyed with the idea of doing one of those maps of the people who used to work for somebody else, like they do this for football coaches, or coaching and coaching. At one point, one of the guys I was looking at, just about half of the CAOs in the region of York at one point had worked for Mike Garrett when he was Mike Garrett when he was either at Peel or at York. About half the CAOs in the lower tier municipalities had worked for him. That tells you something about somebody's leadership. Resilience. No matter how hard you work at something, no matter what you want to accomplish, at some point you will fail. Okay? At some point you'll fail in something that you try to accomplish. And what's significant about failing is not that you failed. What's significant about failing is what you do after you fail. What you do about resilience. All these people had failed at some point or another. Okay? They failed at something. What was significant is the idea that they didn't let it stop them. They didn't let it slow them down. Their idea of failure was, okay, so now I have to figure out a different way to do that. I couldn't do it that way. I failed at doing it that way. Now I've got to figure out a different way of doing it. And this is a direct quotation from somebody that I got that I thought was really very useful. He's talking about he became too committed, too involved in his municipality. You have to be able to give dispassionate advice. It's like surgeons don't operate on their family members, because you have to be dispassionate in what you're dealing with. And if you become too closely identified with your municipality, you can't give that kind of dispassionate advice, and that's what he was talking about here. Okay. Conclusion, some advice. The question sometimes comes up, are leaders born or made? Okay, well, as an educator, I guess I can only give one answer to that. I guess I have to believe that, we can, we've got all these buildings and so forth here. I have to believe that we can accomplish something with that. Well, what I want you to think about is, I've talked about these different trade skills and behaviors of successful leaders. I don't know of any of those things that pretty much anybody can't develop or can't learn in some way or another. Communication skills, building on your weaknesses. I don't know. I don't see anything on that list that people cannot develop in some way or another. So it seems to me that people can learn those skills associated with being leaders. And even if that doesn't take you to be a CAO, even if you choose not to be a CAO, or even if you don't quite get to that level, it seems like all of those things that I talked about are useful trade skills and behaviors to develop for whatever you want to do in whatever kind of organization. The other thing that I got out of talking to people is the idea of consciously managing your career. Okay, so that one of these people took he was in London and he took a job in Casing, and everybody, why would you go from London to Casing? And he did that because he had a particular background. He knew it was going to be difficult for him to break into being a CAO. But if he went north where there wasn't a lot of competition, he could become a deputy CAO and work for somebody that he had work for a CAO that he had a great deal of respect for. He went to Casing for 2 or 3 years, and he came back and ended up being a CAO. So, he managed his career in a particular way because he knew he had a weakness that he had to deal with. Develop basic transferable skills, things like communications, emotional intelligence. Those are skills that you can use in anything, and you can develop these in any job. You have to think of every job as a learning opportunity. Even if you're not happy in a particular job, it's a learning opportunity. Identify mentors like this guy did, I was talking about. He went to Casing because he knew the CAO there was well respected. He knew he was going to learn a lot from working with that CAO, and so that's what he wanted to do. So that's what I wanted to say. I went a little bit over my 30 minutes, but I think we do have some time for questions and answers.
I actually have 2 questions, but I'll just take one at a time. First of all, I think your book is going to be really important for CAOs. It's going to be really important for our program and for anybody who's interested in these issues.
Thank you.
So it's been a long time since I've anticipated the book so much. Secondly, that's just my preliminary.
That's no pressure on me or anything.
So my first question is this, and you didn't mention it in here. I kind of hope it's going to be in the book, but maybe not. I mean, you emphasized the responsibility of the CAO to the council as a collectivity, and you talked about leading up to the council. But I don't think you mentioned the word mayor at all. And I've been thinking of this because I'm not talking about Rob Ford smoking crack cocaine or anything, but we do find out a lot about what's happening in Toronto now because we get these police reports and investigative reporting and everything. And it appeared that if somebody called Rob Ford about a pothole in the street somewhere, that Rob Ford would get on to the city manager, who in turn would get on to somebody else, and they'd fix the pothole. My question really is, to what extent among the CAOs that you looked at was the CAO, did the CAO perceive himself or herself as kind of a subordinate to the mayor as opposed to a subordinate to the council as a whole? And what kind of relationship did they have with the mayor?
Yeah, well, I do talk about that a bit more in the book. Yes, I think that does come through in the book. Well, they're all conscious of the fact, of course, that they work for council as a whole and not directly for the mayor. But they're all also they do know that they have a particular kind of relationship with the mayor that's different from what they have with other councillors. And so a number of them use that in a variety of different ways. in one case, one of the CAOs he was very successful in 2 out of the 3 places where he worked. He was not very successful. This is Mike Garrett, who was the first CAO in Metro. He was the first CAO in the city of Toronto, the enlarged city of Toronto, and his relationship with Mayor Lastman was described by a number of people as chalk and cheese. He never got. They just never got on the same wavelength, and that was one place where he was not. He was very successful when he was in Peel and in York Region, but it just never worked in Toronto. And there were a number of reasons for that, but one was that he did not have a very good relationship with the mayor. The opposite example would be Judy Rogers in Vancouver, who had a very good relationship with one particular mayor. In fact, she was criticized for getting a little bit too close to that mayor. But that relationship caused a lot of changes in the downtown east side in Vancouver, and it resulted in there were a number of things that resulted in the creation of the safe injection site, but it had a lot to do with Mayor Owen and the city manager, Judy Rogers, getting the safe injection site, and that was because of her particular relationship with the mayor. So that, you're right, that is an important aspect of what they do.
So Dave, this is really interesting. One thing that I'm thinking about is this theme of change and CAOs as leaders of an organization taking it in a different direction. You probably know that there's some of the literature on political leaders, like Clarence Stone's work on political leaders in urban politics, that says one hallmark of a great leader is that a leader can take an organization away from sort of an established course of action and send it in a different direction.
Yes.
But of course, and you mentioned this, and I was wondering whether your perspective on CAOs is a little different than, for say, their political equivalents, because obviously CAOs formally don't have that final authority, right? So when you say leading change, what kind of change are you talking about? And is it change that they themselves initiate, or is it leading, for example, on something that councils identify?
One of the things that I struggled with in this, and I don't think I'm finished struggling with it, is when you read about private sector leaders, the word vision is used a lot, that they have a particular vision. You notice I didn't use that word because I had trouble with it, because CAOs, it's not the CAO's job to have a vision for the municipality. That's the council's job. But they did handle that in a number of different ways as far as change. In some cases, what the CAO did was, and I was looking at, I just happened to be looking at this at a time when the dominant organizational structure was changing from the old council committee system to a CAO system. So a couple of these people had a bit of a reputation of establishing a CAO system. So it wasn't that they changed the municipality in a great way, but they did change the organizational structure, which probably did, if we believe the stuff we teach about, organizational structures matter, then it probably did have some change. In other cases, one of the things that you have to think about, I think always as a public servant, and particularly as a city manager, is who do you work for as a CAO? Who do you work for? Do you work for council, or do you work for the community? Are you focused on the public interest? Okay. There's an obvious legal answer to that. Of course you work for council. They hire and fire you and so forth. But when push comes to shove, you take somebody like Judy Rogers, who early in her career worked in the downtown east side in Vancouver. I presume you all know when I talk about downtown east side, you know what I'm talking about in Vancouver. Earlier in her career, she worked in the downtown east side in Vancouver. By the time she became city manager, of course, Vancouver has an at-large system of election, and on council was elected from the downtown east side, nobody on council wanted to talk about the downtown east side. She got it on their agenda, okay, and she did it in a particular way. It's a long story, you have to Bible go. She got it on their agenda, so she did exercise that kind of visionary leadership, that she got something on their agenda that they didn't want to talk about, okay? And of course, some people aren't happy, there's still a lot of problems in the downtown east side, but a lot of things have been accomplished there. So, it's, that's the kind of change that can happen. It can happen either purely at the administrative level, which still has a significant impact, or it can happen in subtle ways. Remember, I said there at one point about council is in charge, but sometimes they need professional advice. Well, that was the Judy Rogers story. She was giving them professional advice about, we've got an issue around the downtown east side. These are things that we can do to deal with that issue. Josh?
So there's 10 people on the live stream, and they want to ask some questions too.
Sure.
So
Okay.
they're on about a 2-minute delay, so you have some time to think up your answer, right?
Okay.
Amanda asks, did leadership brand or type factor in or surface in your discussions?
Okay. Now, you talked about the delay. Should I answer now, or?
You can answer now, and she'll get it in a few minutes.
Okay.
So I'll let her know that I've asked the question.
I did look at leadership style a bit, and I mentioned the idea of the difference between people orientation and task orientation. So I did look at leadership style to a certain amount, but I was looking more at the specific characteristics of the leaders. So differences in style didn't really come through all that much. And particularly, as I say, I've got these cases where, somebody was a polar task-oriented, somebody was polar people-oriented, and they both accomplished what they set out to accomplish very well. So I didn't, if maybe Amanda wants to offer a follow-up question about specific styles or whatever, but it didn't come through the specific styles too much.
Okay, I'll let you know if she says something.
Okay. Yes, Joe?
So, I guess this is just out of curiosity, whether or not this came up in your interviews or not. You mentioned some people moving between single-tier and regional governments, and so I wondered if, working in different structures kind of affected their leadership style. I guess specifically, how they dealt with the constituent municipalities.
Well, it was one of the tasks that they had to deal with, I was asked this a number of times, and it's a little bit difficult to answer because, they had this particular style of dealing with, of managing out, okay? And managing out could be dealing with upper tier, lower tier municipalities, or it could be dealing with citizens groups, or it could be dealing with other governments like the provincial government, or actually in Banff, I was the city manager in Banff, town manager in Banff was one of my cases. He dealt much more with the federal government than the provincial government. It was subsumed under that. I don't know that there was a particularly different style that people had to follow. You have to be conscious of all of these things in your environment, whether you're dealing with an upper tier or a lower tier, or a provincial or federal government, you have to be conscious of all those things. I don't know that it changed what they did radically, changed their approach to things radically.
I have another one if no one else has one. Oh, yeah.
Well, no, you go ahead.
Sure, I'll just follow up. Amanda said, with respect to the previous question, she was thinking of someone who was brought in to reorganize or keep things the status quo. I'm not sure if that's a comment or a question, or if you have something on that. And then I have another question in the queue too.
Okay. Well, I talked about the idea of reorganizing, that the people that I dealt with They did reorganization. From the time they walked in, you could just see the way they were operating. From the time they walked in, they must have been looking at everything around them, saying, how can I improve this? How can I improve that? How can this be done better? You could see that they were just that type of person. But having asked that question and having approached that in that way, they then realized that sometimes if you make a particular change, you're going to have unintended consequences. So, you identify the things that need to be changed, but then you proceed a bit carefully in actually making those decisions. I don't think any of these people would have been happy. I mean, if they were offered a job where their job was to come in and preserve the status quo, I think these people probably wouldn't have taken a job like that, because they were just inveterate people who wanted to change things. And there's probably, so that's, the idea of what I saw about that difference. So, I don't know.
Go ahead with the other.
Sure. Spencer asked, you discussed team building with staff when managing change. Do we see similar relationships develop with council and citizens, or did different qualities emerge dealing with these other groups?
Well, you have to have a different leadership style. I had the slide early on about, the CAOs lead in 3 different directions. And you need a different leadership style in each direction. When you're dealing with subordinates, they didn't often go to command and control mode. But look, when you're dealing with subordinates know command and control is always there. When you're dealing with council, you have to have a different leadership style, based much more on influence, and the same way when you're leading out, you have to have a style based much more on influence. But almost any kind of change, these people were conscious of managing change, that you had to, almost any kind of change you want to make, you have to have those 3 groups involved in some way or another. Not always at the same level, but whatever kind of change that you want to make, you have to have those 3 groups involved. And I get back to the example of Judy Rogers in the downtown east side. She needed local groups to be involved, and she needed them to kind of push to push counselors to get some change. She needed her staff to provide expertise about, this is a way to deal with these problems. And of course, she needed counsel to be on site. So you need to manage all 3 of your relationship in all 3 of those areas, but you need to do it in a different way. Yes.
I have a question pretty much relating to what Josh asked. You mentioned that CAOs are being perceived as a leaders in shadow, but now with the growing demands to include the public participation in decision making and consulting, and in the other side with the social media growing, is that impacting CAOs' role in terms of getting new skills like public speaking and other skills? And if yes, is that also affecting the CAO's relation with the political staff?
Mm-hmm. When you look at the literature, when you look at the way American city managers behave, in many American cities, people would know the name of the city manager as much as they would know the name of the mayor. The city manager has almost the same profile as the mayor. Canadian public servants generally, federal, provincial, and local, are conditioned, right now they're conditioned in a very different way. And I think right now they see themselves as the leaders in the shadows. All of these people talked about the way in which they always took a back seat in what the thing that was going on, and they always pushed the politicians up front. I don't see, if you're asking me today, I don't know that I see a lot of evidence of that change. But I understand where your question's coming from, and it'll be an interesting trend to look at. But at this point, I see Canadian public servants as being very well conditioned about this idea of staying in the shadows.
Thank you, very interesting. I'm wondering if any of the CIOs talked about workload, sort of what the demands are on their time and balancing that with life and other things.
You know, nobody complained about that. I mean, I think everybody understood that being a CAO is your life. Okay, I mean, I think everybody understood that going into it, and frankly, they all thrived on it. You know, and I remember some people would, more than one person said, I talk to my staff about the need for work-life balance. Of course, I don't do that myself, but I talk to my staff about the importance of it. You know, it's a huge workload. But they were all conditioned to it, and nobody complained about it. You know.
My second question is actually was real supplementary to that one, so I'm going to pursue it. I wanted to ask, it sort of relates to the full-time MPA students. I've always thought that our full-time MPA students, the ideal job would be to be on the staff of a CAO in a large municipality. I don't care what the job title would be, executive assistant, whatever, just assistant could be. But if the workload is so heavy, which I'm sure it is in a big municipality, surely these CAOs need some kind of personal staff, not just somebody to answer the phone, or they need somebody to help them manage all the issues that are coming and do some research for them and that kind of thing. So how many of them either had that kind of staff or saw the need for it?
You know, as you would know, we haven't had a real CAO system for that long, and I think CAOs are still at a place where, how would I put this? They're almost struggling for the legitimacy of their position. And the idea of hiring a whole bunch of people, and this is the way it would be perceived, right, by council.
Yeah, no, I know the problem.
It was the way they would be perceived by council, and it would also was the way it would be perceived by their senior staff. They were very reluctant to hire a lot of people in their office. Now, in something like Toronto and Peel and so forth, there were people there. In other cases, Michael Fenn, when he was in Burlington, he consciously had a program of seconding people from other departments to spend a few months, and because he, you know, some CAOs think consciously about training people and developing people, and I mean that would be good get back to your early point. That would be very good advice to, you know, to be in a CAO's office where you get a sense of everything that's happening in the municipality. That would be an excellent, you know, if you get an opportunity for that for a period of time, that would be an excellent window into what goes on. Because, you know, I don't want to go on a rant here, but one of my complaints, one of my concerns about what happens typically in municipalities is you get hired in one of these silos and you progress up the silos, and there's very little opportunity to move to different silos. And then all these people, you get all these people at the top, and then councillors are surprised. We don't have anybody who's really qualified, who really understands the entire municipality, and they're tremendously surprised at that, when in fact that's the way the whole system is structured. So that's another bit of advice I could give you probably in terms of managing your career. Don't let yourself get put in one of those silos. You know, try to move to a number of different organizations, including the CAO's office. Yes.
Thank you. I'm also looking forward to reading your book. It sounds very intriguing. I have a question about workloads. I recall in your article before about CEOs managing down and out, that you said they spend about 10 minutes on any given issue. The 5 people you followed, have there been any issue that you think they did more than 10 minutes or longer? Which issue would you think
Well, the problem, when I was talking about that 10 minutes, I was talking about the hectic, disorganized nature of their day. And this is why, this gets back to what I was talking about earlier, that sometimes when I'm giving this talk, and I have more time, I talk about what CAOs do, what they really do. And the CAOs, a number of CAOs that I spoke to, expressed frustration that they really were not involved very much in really managing things, if you know what I mean. I mean, as a CAO, you've got this vision of the entire municipality from about 5,000 or 10,000 feet, which means that you're not deeply involved. Mike Garrett, who when he worked for the Metro Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, he built a variety of parks along the Toronto waterfront. And he was really proud, even after 30 to 40 years, he was really proud of what he had done in terms of building those parks. And he was really frustrated as a CAO that, I don't build parks anymore. As a CAO, I've got responsibility for all these people who are building parks, but I don't get involved in that. So, it's a tremendous workload, but their concern was that, instead of building the park, he spends 10 minutes talking to the person who's building the park, and then somebody else comes in the office and it's 10 minutes talking about a problem in social housing, and then it's 10 minutes. The idea is that they have a very chaotic and fragmented workday where they have to do a whole variety of different things, but they don't get really immersed and they don't have a sense of really accomplishing any particular thing because their day is so fragmented like that.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question. Josh, is there anything
Nope.
coming from
Just
there?
some mild criticisms about me bumping the camera. I was typing a little too hard. I think it was wiggling it. So no, actually, and everybody who asked the question all ended up saying thanks for your answers as well. So.
Anybody else? Yes.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for making the trip out here. I'm sure we all appreciate it. Second, my question is, there's sort of two spheres of leadership. There's sort of populist leadership and individual leadership. An example of populist leadership might be, I did what the people wanted, I acted on the will of the majority, that makes me a leader.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to individual leadership, where I act on the court of my own conscience, I did what I thought was right, that makes me a leader. How would someone in a senior municipal leadership position like a CAO reconcile the two, especially when there's so many competing voices from above council, from below staff, and leading out from citizen engagement groups?
Yeah, that balance of doing what they feel is right, the individual leadership versus what is the population, what's the feeling in the population. Is that?
Yeah.
I think one of the skills that these people all tended to have was a certain amount of patience and a certain amount of, remember I said one of the things I said there about understanding the political impact, understanding the political environment. I had a sense from some of these people that they had a shelf, they had a figurative shelf in their office of things that they wanted to accomplish. But they knew that timing is the essence of being able to accomplish some things. So they were focused on individual leadership. They knew what needed to be done, but they also were politically sensitive enough to know what was going to fly right now and what would be better if they waited until a particular time, if they seeded certain ideas. So they were conscious of what they wanted to do, and they had a plan of what they wanted to accomplish. But they knew that timing was important in terms of accomplishing that. They knew that there were some things that they just needed to put on the back burner now, and other things that they could move forward. So they were conscious of that broader populist idea, but they didn't completely give into it in the sense of I'm going to do whatever the populace wants. But they also were conscious of only having a certain amount of resources, and they were conscious of not wanting to throw away resources in fighting an issue that was never going to succeed now. They knew they had to wait until the appropriate time for that. Is that the sort of thing you were getting at?
Yeah, I think that addresses the question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Professor Siegel for a great session.
Okay,
And thank you for coming out.
Okay.
And just want to remind everybody that we have a seminar again next month. Jennifer Smout, who many of you know from the Municipal Law course, is going to come and talk about some recent important cases in municipal law. And so thanks again to Dave and to all of you. And,
Okay, well, thank you. This was great. I enjoyed chatting with you. So.
This is where we should be able to buy autographed copies of the book.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.